Somewhere in a Samsung lab right now, a thin layer of silver, thinner than a human hair, is quietly rewriting the future of every electric vehicle on Earth. And Wall Street wants you to believe this means silver prices are about to explode. But here's what nobody is telling you. There is a second battery being tested right now inside a Dodge Charger that uses zero silver. And if that technology wins, the silver story you've been sold could collapse overnight. So before you buy another ounce, ask yourself, what if the guaranteed demand everyone is promising you isn't guaranteed at all? Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something, not as a host talking to a camera, but as one person speaking to another. If you're the kind of person who values getting the full picture before making a decision with your hard-earned money, then this channel was built for people exactly like you. So would you do me the honor of subscribing, not for me, but for yourself? So the next time we uncover something that could protect your savings, it finds you first. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from today? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. It always amazes me how far and wide this community truly reaches. Now, let's get into it. In a quiet research facility outside Seoul, engineers were putting the finishing touches on something they believed would change the auto industry forever. They called it the AGC architecture. Silver carbon, a nautilus. To most people, the name meant nothing. But to anyone tracking the future of electric vehicles, it meant everything. Samsung SDI was not just building a better battery. They were building the battery that every major automaker would eventually need. And the material at the center of it all was silver. By early 2026, word of this breakthrough had spread far beyond the world of engineers and battery scientists. It reached investors. It reached precious metals dealers. It reached everyday people who had never owned a single ounce of silver in their lives, but were suddenly being told with great confidence that 2027 would be the year everything changed. The pitch was simple, and it was powerful. Solid-state batteries were coming. Silver was the key ingredient making them possible. Demand for silver was about to surge like never before. And anyone who bought now, before the wave hit, would be standing on the right side of history. It sounded almost too good to pass up. And a new technology, a famous company, a timeline that felt close enough to touch. For many, this was the kind of story that justified moving money quickly before the opportunity disappeared. But the most convincing stories are often the ones worth slowing down for. Samsung's engineers had, in fact, solved a real and serious problem. For years, solid-state batteries had been held back by something called dendrites, tiny, needle-like structures that formed inside the battery during fast charging. Left unchecked, these structures could pierce through the battery's internal layers, causing it to fail, sometimes catastrophically. It was one of the biggest obstacles standing between solid-state batteries and mass production. Samsung's answer was an extremely thin layer of silver, placed precisely at the point where failure usually began. The silver did something remarkable. It stabilized the flow of lithium, forcing it to spread evenly instead of forming the dangerous spikes that caused dendrites in the first place. The result was a battery that could charge in minutes instead of hours, and one that could last for decades without breaking down. This was not a small achievement. It was the kind of breakthrough that automakers had been waiting years to see. Premium car manufacturers had already tested early samples and reported strong results. Government regulators in Japan had granted production approval. The momentum behind silver-based solid-state batteries was real, and it was growing. So, when people heard about this technology and rushed to buy silver, their instinct was not foolish. They were responding to genuine, well-documented progress. They were not chasing a rumor. They were chasing a fact. And yet, a fact is not the same thing as the whole picture. Every great economic story has two layers. The first layer is the breakthrough itself, the part that gets reported, celebrated, and shared. The second layer is everything happening quietly around that breakthrough. The competition, the cost pressures, the alternatives being developed in parallel, often with far less attention. It is this second layer that usually determines whether an investment thesis holds up over time, or whether it was built on a story that was only half true. Silver's case looked strong on the surface. The science was sound. The timeline seemed close. The big names were involved. But strong surfaces can still hide weak foundations, and the people who profit most from a rising market are rarely the same people who warn you about what lies beneath it. This is where the real investigation begins. Not with the question of whether Samsung's technology works. It clearly does. The real question is whether silver's role in that technology is as secure, as permanent, and as irreplaceable as the headlines suggested. Because if there is even a chance that this is not the case, then anyone holding silver purely because of this one battery story deserves to know it. What follows is not a story about hype. It is a careful look at the engineering, the competition, and the economics behind one of the most talked about metals of the decade, and whether the promise being sold to the public matches the reality being built in the lab. To understand why silver became the centerpiece of this story, one has to go back to the actual problem engineers were trying to solve. It was not a marketing problem, it was a physics problem, and for more than a decade, it had no clean solution. Inside every solid-state battery, lithium moves back and forth during charging. When charging happens quickly, that movement becomes chaotic. Instead of spreading evenly, the lithium tends to pile up in small, sharp points. Scientists call these dendrites. Left alone, they grow like tiny needles, pushing through the battery's internal barriers until they cause a short circuit. In the worst cases, this leads to overheating, fire, or complete failure. For years, this single issue was the reason solid-state batteries stayed locked in research labs instead of reaching consumers. Companies could build the technology, they could demonstrate it, but they could not make it safe enough, fast enough to charge, and durable enough to sell at scale. Samsung's engineers approached this problem differently than most. Instead of trying to eliminate dendrites after they formed, they focused on preventing the conditions that created them in the first place. Their solution involved placing an extremely thin layer of silver combined with carbon directly at the point inside the battery where lithium movement was most unstable. The silver acted almost like a guide. It encouraged the lithium to settle in a smooth, even layer rather than collecting into sharp points. This single design choice solved the dendrite problem in a way that had eluded researchers for years. The results were significant. Batteries built this way could charge in about 9 minutes. They could last for an estimated 20 years of use, far longer than typical lithium-ion batteries on the road today. There was something else too, something less obvious but equally important. Silver does not degrade the way many other materials do. It can react with its environment over time, sometimes changing in appearance, but its core structure remains intact. Inside a battery expected to last 2 decades, this kind of long-term stability mattered enormously. This is why automakers paid attention. Premium manufacturers tested early battery samples and reported positive feedback, a strong signal in an industry where companies rarely commit publicly without good reason. One major manufacturer secured formal government approval to begin production, with plans to introduce the technology first in higher-end and hybrid vehicles, where cost pressures were less severe. Researchers outside the auto industry were reaching similar conclusions. Independent studies on treating battery components with thin layers of silver showed dramatic improvements in durability, with some materials becoming several times more resistant to cracking under stress. These findings were not isolated. They came from multiple sources, using different methods, and they kept pointing in the same direction. Silver was not simply a popular choice. It was, by the available evidence, an effective one. This pattern is worth pausing on, because it explains why the silver narrative spread so quickly and convinced so many serious people. It was not built on speculation. It was built on real laboratory results, real industry testing, and real government approvals. Each piece, taken on its own, was credible. Together, they formed a story that seemed almost impossible to argue against. It is easy to understand why investors, dealers, and everyday savers looked at this evidence and felt confident. They were not being reckless. They were responding to a technology that genuinely worked, developed by a company with the resources and reputation to bring it to market. In a world full of uncertain claims, this looked like one of the rare cases where the science, the timeline, and the corporate backing all lined up. But there is an important detail that often gets lost in stories like this one. A material can be the best solution to a specific engineering problem and still not be the only solution available. Being effective is not the same as being irreplaceable. And in any industry where cost determines whether a product reaches millions of people or only a few thousand, even the best solution can eventually be replaced by one that is simply good enough at a fraction of the price. This is the question worth holding on to as the story continues. Silver solved a real problem, and it solved it well. But somewhere else, away from the headlines celebrating Samsung's breakthrough, other engineers were working on a very different kind of answer, one that did not need silver at all. While Samsung's silver-based battery was receiving most of the attention, a quieter story was unfolding in research labs and boardrooms far from the spotlight. It involved companies that had looked at the same dendrite problem, reached the same conclusion about its seriousness, and then solved it without using silver at all. One of the most significant developments came from a partnership between a battery technology company and a major German automaker. Instead of relying on silver to stabilize lithium during charging, their approach used a specially engineered ceramic separator. This separator served a similar purpose to Samsung's silver layer, controlling the way lithium moved inside the battery, but it did so using materials that cost a fraction of what silver commanded on the open market. This partnership was not a small experiment. It was backed by a formal, large-scale licensing agreement, signed with the intention of scaling production within a few years. For an industry built on long timelines and cautious commitments, this kind of agreement signaled genuine confidence, not just from the technology developer, but from one of the largest vehicle manufacturers in the world. At the same time, a separate shift was happening across the broader auto industry. Many manufacturers, facing pressure to cut costs while still improving performance, began turning towards silicon-based battery components. as a practical middle step. These were not full solid-state batteries in the strictest sense, but they offered a meaningful improvement in energy storage, 20 to 30% better than standard designs, without requiring expensive materials like silver. Because they were cheaper and easier to produce at scale, they were already entering the market while silver-based alternatives were still years away from mass production. Then there was a development that surprised even some industry insiders. A well-known dry process solid-state battery developed through a partnership involving Honda was being tested inside one of the most ordinary mass-market vehicles imaginable. Not a luxury car, not an exclusive prototype reserved for wealthy early adopters. A Dodge Charger, a vehicle built for everyday buyers. This detail mattered more than it might first appear. It suggested that some companies were not aiming their solid-state technology at premium markets first. They were trying to build something affordable enough for ordinary drivers from the very beginning. And critically, this approach did not rely on silver in any meaningful way. Taken together, these developments painted a very different picture from the one most people were hearing. The popular narrative suggested that silver was the chosen path forward, the material the entire industry was converging on. The reality was more complicated. Multiple serious companies, each with significant resources and credibility, were actively working to avoid silver altogether, not because the metal failed to work, but because its cost created a different kind of obstacle. This is the part of the story that rarely makes headlines. It is far easier to report on a single dramatic breakthrough than to explain a slow, distributed shift happening across an entire industry. A breakthrough has a clear hero, a clear company, and a clear narrative. A quiet pivot toward cheaper alternatives, spread across several competitors, does not offer the same simple story, but it can be just as important, sometimes more so, for understanding where prices and demand are actually headed. For anyone holding silver because of its connection to next-generation batteries, this competitive landscape deserves serious attention. It does not mean Samsung's technology will fail, or that silver will lose its place in the industry entirely, but it does mean that silver is not the only path forward, and it is not guaranteed to remain the cheapest or most attractive one as these competing technologies continue to mature. The question now is no longer simply whether solid-state batteries are coming. They clearly are. The real question is which version of that future actually arrives first, and whether silver is positioned to benefit from it or quietly left behind by it. You said, now move to the final part. 400 to 600 words. After examining the engineering breakthroughs, the competing technologies, and the companies racing toward the same goal from different directions, one question remains the most important of all. Not whether solid-state batteries are coming, but when and at what cost to anyone holding silver based on promises about their arrival. History offers a useful warning here. Solid-state battery timelines have been pushed back again and again for more than 10 years. Companies have announced breakthroughs, set ambitious target dates, and then quietly moved those dates further into the future as real-world manufacturing challenges proved harder than expected. This pattern did not happen once. It happened repeatedly across multiple companies and multiple technologies. There is no clear reason to assume this time will be different, simply because the headlines sound more confident than before. Even under the most optimistic outlook, silver-based batteries are expected to appear first in premium and hybrid vehicles, not in the affordable cars that make up the majority of vehicles sold worldwide. This detail matters enormously. A technology used only in expensive, low-volume vehicles does not create the kind of massive silver demand that many people were led to expect. Mass market adoption, the kind that would meaningfully shift silver's price over the long term, remains years away, and possibly further than the public timeline suggests. At the same time, the cost of silver itself works against its own success story. As prices climb toward new highs, the very technology built to showcase silver's value became harder to justify financially. Manufacturers do not select materials based on performance alone. They select materials based on performance relative to cost, especially when building vehicles meant for millions of ordinary buyers. A battery that delivers excellent results but requires a costly amount of silver per vehicle becomes a luxury feature, not a mass market standard. This is precisely why competing technologies deserve serious weight in this discussion. Silicon-based components, ceramic separators, and other emerging designs are not simply backup plans. In several cases, they are already entering production faster than silver-based alternatives, specifically because they are cheaper to scale. If these technologies continue to close the performance gap, manufacturers will have little financial incentive to commit to silver at current price levels, no matter how impressive its engineering results may be. None of this means silver has no future in next-generation batteries. The science remains genuinely strong, and Samsung's progress is real, not exaggerated. But strong science does not guarantee market dominance, especially in an industry defined by intense cost competition and a long history of delayed timelines. For anyone who purchased silver specifically because of this battery narrative, the lesson is not to panic, and it is not to abandon the metal entirely. The lesson is to separate genuine technological progress from the assumption that this progress guarantees a predictable near-term price surge. Those are two very different things, and treating them as identical is where the real risk lies. The companies racing towards solid-state batteries are not waiting for silver to prove itself the only answer. They're actively building alternatives in parallel, often with less attention but no less ambition. Anyone making decisions based on the silver story alone is making a decision based on half the picture. The full picture includes competition, cost pressure, and a track record of delayed promises. Recognizing that difference before committing capital rather than after is what separates an informed decision from one built on a story that sounded complete but never was.